Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Manager for Dataversity. We'd like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, The Importance of Master Data Management. It is the latest installment in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken, brought to you in partnership with Data Blueprint. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. Just click the chat icon in the upper right-hand corner for that feature. For questions, we will be collecting them via the Q&A in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or if you'd like to tweet, we encourage you to share highlights or questions via Twitter using #DataEd. To answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides. And yes, we are recording and will likewise send a link to the recording of this session, as well as any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now let me introduce to you our speaker for today. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you already know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. Peter is also the founding director of Data Blueprint. He has written dozens of articles and 11 books. The most recent is Your Data Strategy. Peter is experienced with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and consistently named as a top data management expert. Some of the most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his and Data Blueprint's expertise. Peter has spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter today to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Hi, Shannon. Welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be with everybody. My slides in the right shape. There we go. So today's topic is going to be talking specifically about reference and master data management. We had a creative person at one point said, this is really the eternal management of the data mind. I don't know that you want to go into your boss with that kind of a message, but let's start out with a little context here. Data is today's most powerful, underutilized, poorly managed organizational data asset. It's the only asset that you have that isn't depletable, it doesn't degrade over time, it is durable in nature, and it exists at the strategic level. When you compare data assets to other assets, the data assets win, but unfortunately people don't have very good ways of conceptualizing it. The most popular way people are thinking about data now, if you Google the phrase data is the new oil, you'll see it exists in about 5,000 Google hits out there. I'd like you to think about it a little bit differently. Let's think about it from a gardening metaphor and call it the new soil.
Peter, we seem to have lost you here. We can't hear you. All right, everyone, let me see what I can do to get Peter back. Hi, I'll apologize for the little audio blip here. We've got, I'm working with Peter to get him back online, so stay tuned. Technology is great when it works. All right, Peter, looks like you're back on there. I'm switching up presenter for you. And it looks like you're still muted. Here, I'm going to unmute you.
She always mutes. I do not know what happened, folks. I think AT&T dropped the call or something, but where were we? All right. We were up at soil. Everything look good from your end, Shannon?
Yeah, looking good. So if we can just.
All right. Yep.
All
keep
right.
going. Thanks. Sorry, guys. All right. So anyway, people say data is the new oil. I want you to think about it as the new soil. Two important components of soil. One, you have to prepare the soil in order to get it ready. And two, it takes time. You don't just plant things on Tuesday and they show up on Thursday. If you want to call it bacon, that works. I'm okay with that. More to the point, though, data does deserve its own strategy as a strategic asset. It deserves attention on par with similar organizational assets, and it really does need professional administration to make up for past neglect on this. So what we're going to talk about today is reference data and data management and why are they important. We'll look at some specific building blocks and get to some guiding principles and best practices, and then get to the part of this that's the most fun, which is the Q&A at the very end on all of this. So let's get started, jump right in. What is, first of all, data management? We have very, very rudimentary definitions. Most people think of data management as the stuff between the sources and the uses of data. And that's certainly true, but it's not helpful. And we've got a little better and defined it as data engineering, storage, data delivery. We need some governance processes around it, of course, which means we need some specialized team skills. Now, even this definition is not a terrific definition, however, because it misses the big important point of data, which is that this model does not well depict reuse. And data, of course, is more useful when it's reused than when it's used in the first place. Data key on this, another definition, is to look at this in terms of putting the resources center, looking at it as really an enterprise-wide function such that everybody is involved in it. If you're a knowledge worker, you're involved in data management. And so the scope is much broader than we need to have before. Most people also aren't aware that data is an awful lot like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We start out at the bottom level with our physiological needs. If we have food, clothing, and shelter needs that are unmet, we won't be safe. If we're never safe, we'll never have love and belonging in our lives. If we don't have love and belonging, we never get to esteem, and if we never get to esteem, we never get to self-actualization. So that's, of course, what we want to get to. Here's our pyramid that looks suspiciously like that. Data management practices are really all technology-based. They sit up at the top of this pyramid, which, of course, we know is just the tip of the pyramid here. And we need to put these other practices in place to provide a good supporting foundation. Again, most everything that's being written or talked about is a technology-focused. Very little is talked about in terms of capabilities. That's really where we need to put our effort as professionals here. Now, we get a question at Data Blueprint an awful lot, which is that, yes, Peter, I hear you saying this. I know we need to work carefully through the process. But on the other hand, my boss really wants it by Friday, so can you do it faster? And the answer is, yes, we can go faster, but if we do, it will take longer, it will cost more, it will deliver less, and it will present greater risk than other parts of the organization. We also talk about, and we'll have a full webinar on this, I think, in May. We're going to talk about the DMM. So we're talking about data management strategy, which is managing your data coherently, looking at professional management within there, maintaining fit for cost, fit for purpose, with the right architecture and the right processes that we put in place around it. If we don't have these, of course, it becomes much more difficult. Now, this is what we think of as the DMM. Most people are familiar with the capability maturity model from Carnegie Mellon. We're going to talk about it here just a little bit in terms of what it needs to happen. The CMM, and if your boss, by the way, your boss knows about CMM, so if you just tell them this is CMM for data, they'll understand that. Now, the way this process works is that you get 1 point for having a pulse. You get 2 points if whatever you do is repeatable, 3 if it's just documented. And once it's documented, then you can measure it, that's 4, and then 5 if you do some optimization around it. And one of the things that most people are simply not aware of is that if my organization was scored in the following fashion, where data governance, data quality, data platform architecture, and data resources, operations were all at level 3, but I didn't have a strategy around it, well, the entire foundation is only as strong as the weakest link. It means you could pour $1 billion into data quality and it wouldn't help, because if you don't have a strategy around it, it's just throwing money down the drain. The DMBOK that we have now at version 2 still looks very similar to this, and of course you see that reference or master data management is still one of the major pieces. We took this piece out of the DMBOK, but it now represents a very nice summary of our reference and master data pieces here. I'm not going to read all these words to you. You guys can read this. Of course, it'll be in your slides, but it does sort of represent what we're going to talk about today. So let's dive in specifically and look at reference and master data. And I'm going to start out by telling a quick little story. There is an organization that started to go in and put a new system in. And as they were putting this new system in place, they put in an MDM system. Now, the problem was the users really didn't know what the MDM was. So they put in what I call a one-legged stool. They got very good technology, and we know the technology works. It's software. It works very, very well. But it wouldn't be a very comfortable ride if they gave you a one-legged stool. The general agreement was that they needed to go back and restart the effort because whatever they were trying to do wasn't working. They went back and said, let's do some root cause analysis. They took good software and filled it up with extremely poor quality data. And when they did that, of course, the system doesn't work. And everybody not surprised why that happens. So the response was the organization said, let's get data quality. And that kind of gave them a little bit more of a leg. It was not exactly what they needed. They were not still experienced there, so I gave them a half a leg for that piece. So they may have data quality working in their master data initiative, but it still didn't help because their data quality practices were so immature and they were so technologically focused by buying just strictly a technology tool. Now again, a tool in the hands of a fool, you still have a fool on the other side of it. So let's look at a couple of quick definitions. By the way, MDM outside of our discipline means mobile device management, so don't get people confused with that. But Gardner has done a very good job, I think, of describing this one, where the business and IT work together to ensure uniform master data. Now we'll get to that in just a little bit, what master data is, but it's sold often as a solution. So people will look at a messy organization and say, this is messy, I'm not sure what we need to do with it. Well, one of the questions will come up, do you have an MDM? No, therefore you need one, right? The better definition for this is that it's an official, consistent set of identifiers. Now, I mentioned I was here in Washington, D.C., and I was talking to an old friend of mine who I had worked with 25 years ago in the Department of Defense, and she said, you know those data models we were working with in the old days, they haven't changed much. And the answer is yes, that's correct. They have not changed much at all. We're talking about things like parties, places, and things. All right, and the parties, I've got a definition out there for you. By the way, LEI, if you're not familiar with it, is Legal Entity Identifier. This is something that the federal government started so that we could find out when there is a financial crisis who is actually holding the accountability for the various things that were involved in that. These master data items provide transactional context. That just means if I'm taking $20 out of the ATM machine, the bank needs to know which account I'm taking it out of, Peter's account or somebody else's, right? It comes from the term master file. And if we go back in history a little bit, you'll see that we used to have transaction processing like this. We would start the bank balance out. Let's say I had $100 in my old master file and I made that $20 withdrawal today. So then there's an update program that produces a new master file. The new master file then has my balance at $80 instead of $20. And of course we want to have any error messages that are associated with it just to make sure. So that's our master data management context. We talk about this in terms of a golden version. Now the gold version is the final version of the CD or the product that we've said. We've gone golden, we've made it up to some level of assuring that this is the right place. So it's the right address, the right types of things there in that. So again, master data management, planning, implementation, control activities ensure consistency with a golden version of the data values that are there. Let's switch for a little bit and move over to reference data because they are often handled the same. They are not the same. This is control over the domain values, the vocabularies that are associated with your master data. These are the standardized terms, the code values, the other unique identifiers that has business definitions for the relationships that are there. And these are things that we want to use consistently over time. I'll give you a quick example on that. If I have reference data, the data may be used to describe the codes that we're going to use to identify countries. Well, if we use U.S., that means United States. But a lot of people like to think that the United Kingdom is abbreviated UK. And reference data would be saying, no, you need to use the proper standard on that, which would be Great Britain, GB, not UK. So it means if you want to count up the customers that exist in the UK and you don't have master data managed, you might have to test for both GB as well as UK values. By the way, UK for some organizations also means unknown. So that's not necessarily the way that you want to do it. So again, these master values that allow people to use this information across the entire organization. They provide context for transactions, but it's not limited to predefined definition. Again, it's parties, locations from that term master file. Let's give an example that brings both of these concepts together. This is from a lawsuit I was involved with many years ago. It was in Canada, it turns out. And the Canadian Social Security system mandated the maintenance of 9 gender codes that were involved in this particular lawsuit. You can see them again. It's male, female, formerly male, now female, formerly female, now male, uncertain, won't tell, doesn't know, male certain to be female, and female soon to be male. No, this is not a comedy show. These are the used codes that the Canadian government maintained by law in order to do this. The reference data is the control over these, the fact that they have 9 values. If you had a database in Canada and you were maintaining information on Canadian persons during this time, you had to have these possible 9 gender codes to pick from. You couldn't have more, or you couldn't have less. In other words, if you just said, well, everybody's either male or female, aren't they? Well, no, that's the very definition of reference data. Now, if we extend that concept to master data, then what we might say is that the golden source of the gender of your customer, Pat, is one of these 9 values. That's when reference data is used now to populate a master data management field. The real key for all this is to understand that most people get confused between the technology and the actual functionality of what's happening. A master data management software solution is part of an overall master data management program, but it is not the program as itself. So let's go a little further here. Why is reference in MDM important? Well, these are old facts, but they haven't changed materially. There's all kinds of extremely poor quality reference data out there. There are homegrown solutions. There are people who are doing whatever they can trying to reinvent the wheel. And what, of course, we'd like everybody to do is to back away from these and to say, no, there are, in fact, proper ways of doing this. So many organizations still continue to move into this. What we find realistically is that to do this properly, you really need that 3-legged stool I was describing earlier. We consider it to be a combination of data governance, master data, and data quality. I'll show you how all these are related. Data governance is required to make the case for and is then responsible for making sure that the master data is of sufficient quality. So the governance is the group that says you can buy the software and spend some money on it, but if before you put any data into that system, don't forklift it. In other words, make sure that the data is of clean quality, because if it's not, it will not be successful. Data quality is, of course, a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to the success of master data initiatives. And the MDM capabilities really do constrain the governance effectiveness around that possibility. So it's kind of a nice interdependent cycle. Let me show you an even more complex example. This is one that we were working on for a bank for a little while here. They had a number of systems of record. These systems of record here were different ways in which they kept track of their master data. The problem was we weren't sure. They had not been able to do data quality on it, so they were having to do data quality after the fact rather than as a anticipatory action in there. So they pulled out and had us architect something they called an indicator extraction service, which just was a way of doing a general query across all the systems of record. The key was that this extraction service could put information in a very close to the customer cache, such that when a customer accessed the bank, through any one of the channels. A channel might be an ATM machine, it might be a teller, number of different ways of accessing, could be an email, call, right? They would also throw this latency check in. In other words, how long has it been since this customer has called us? Just so that they could say, hey, Peter, we haven't seen you for 5 years. Really, has it been that long? You know, I hope I'm not talking to my dentist. Anyway, gives you the idea that allows the organization to understand what was going on. And we could ask some questions. Say, hey, you know, would you mind updating your address information so we can stay in better contact with you? And that information would get pushed back into the organization. We could also then use this same master data management architecture to start validating external addresses and data we provided from the outside. So all of this solution framework allows the organization to get a better handle on it. Now, this is, again, a reactive scenario, not a proactive scenario, but still allows us to build these piles of master data much more quickly and efficiently. Now, notice I've also taken in the center of this diagram here our definition of data management, which we already agreed was not a great one. And let's look at how intertwined these various activities might end up being for an organization. On the bottom right-hand corner, I've got the master data management practices. It's data that might benefit from master data management. That allows us to go in to access the operational data and determine whether or not the operational data needs to be updated or not. We can also put some quality problems around that and look specifically, if we have a quality issue, we can come into the process from the left-hand side of the diagram. We also do, of course, routine data scans just to keep things going all the way around. And then there were some formal knowledge practices that we put in place as well. So once again, you can see that master data management by itself is probably not going to solve all of your problems that you have in data, but it is a key component for a lot of them. One more example of these interactions here, and then we'll go back to a couple of very specifics on this. Again, data scans allow the organization to look for things like violations or monitoring types of operations. These rules and things allow us to go in, and our governance practices are the things that allow us to keep abreast of what's actually happening in that. There's going to be some data quality monitoring in there, but there's no point in doing data quality monitoring if you have an MDM solution unless you're incorporating that in with your master data. So these results give us specific data quality problems, also the characteristics and characteristics and specifications for the various MDM operations that are in here. So master data is going to be a part of your solution, but certainly not everything. And one of the reasons we need to do this is because our way of growing data has always been kind of interesting. Typically things start out in these, some people call them silos of excellence, right? But your payroll data is associated with your payroll, your R&D data is associated with your R&D data, and those work very well. These are our pieces that we'd like to take a look at. It works great until somebody says, oh, can you connect this to that, or that to this, or this to that? And now things start to get pretty confused. It works much better if you use the same master data to make sure that when I'm talking about Peter's records and payroll, we're also talking about Peter's records and personnel and everywhere else in the organization. I'll give you one other example around this as well. There's an organization we were working with recently that was looking at buying a software package. And the software package, interestingly enough, was having to do with oil in tanks. So here we have some oil, and there's some oil. This package considered the transfer of oil or gasoline, whatever the petroleum product was, from one tank to another to be a retail sale. Well, certainly in these two instances that I'm showing you, it absolutely is. On the other hand, if I put it in this tank, that's not a retail sale. That's a cost of doing business. Same thing if I transfer it from the truck to the stationary tank. That also is a cost of doing business. If I transfer it to the floating tank or the flying tank, these are all costs of doing business, not necessarily anything having to do with retail sales. Now, the reason I describe this story to you is because when you look at this organization, they were trying to figure out, should I modify the software that I'm going to buy? This was not master data management software, this was accounting software they were looking at. And in order to modify the software, they would have to hire consultants. The consultants would come in, make some changes. When they made those changes would then be reflected in the overall process. And they'd have to be repeated every time we put a new version of this software in. It's a very expensive process, something that was certainly not adding value to the organization. So the organization proposed instead that they use something we call a controlled vocabulary, which is, of course, exactly what master data management is attempting to do. They were never allowed to use the word tank anymore in this organization. They had to fully qualify it. This was a gasoline tank, an automobile tank. Those are retail sales. A boat tank, that was not a retail sale. A truck tank, that in this case, because it's the tank on the back of the truck, was not a retail sale. So by using this controlled vocabulary around this, they were able to avoid the problem of modifying their software, and it helped get them started on the road to master data management. Now, of course, we can get those tanks confused with these tanks, which is another problem, but that's not what we're talking about, or tanked, which is another piece around that as well. Okay, bad humor, we'll move on. So let's look at how these master and reference data architectures should be put in place. When we talk about a code management system here, what we're talking about specifically is that we're talking about the codes that use. Again, M for male, F for female if we're using those codes, or 1 and 2, or 1 through 9, right, in our gender code example earlier. This gives you a reference database of record. It's not going to be a large one, but if you have a lot of reference data items, you want those data items perhaps to be controlled on a nightly basis to update the data warehouse. So if I decide that I'm going to add a 10th gender code, by the way, if we're going to get in silly about gender codes, Facebook currently counts, I think, 66 different gender types that can be applied to your Facebook profile. We could update the data warehouse then and assume that if we make that change in the day, that by the next day, all the records would be updated. That would give us the ability then, when people are reading the data, to have the right reference data associated with each of the data items there. Same type of process here for a master data architecture. The master database of record, again, is what allows us to feed the metadata into the data warehouse so that if Peter changes his address, he only has to do it in one place. Now, this was particularly interesting when I was teaching at university. It used to be that if you were a student at the university, you had to know that there were 6 places around the university you had to change your address or your name or any of the other master data, if you will, that was around that. And if you changed 5 of the 6, you may not get your bill or your grades, or something else bad would not happen, or would happen even. Really problematic all the way around. So key to this was obviously getting all of this to work in a nice integrated fashion. The university now has a master data record for each student, and that master data record controls things like their address, what their name is, et cetera, around that. You can combine these in a number of different ways so that everybody is allowed to take a look at what's going on and all that sort of thing. But the real key is that you've got the ability now to control these sets of vocabularies that you're using all around the whole process here. The problem is master data management has not got a good track record. Now, let's put this in context, of course. We know that IT only has 1/3 of their projects come in on time, within budget, within the schedule, within the budget schedule and functionality. There we go, third thing on that. It's just abysmal. Well, master data is even worse than that. And the reason is somewhat like the analogy of handing the keys to your new Tesla to a 16-year-old driver that doesn't have any driving experience and somehow expecting to have a good outcome on this. Most organizations just simply are not mature enough to be able to put this discipline in place. And I've already showed you that the key for this is not to look at it from a technology first perspective, but instead to look at it as a business strategy perspective. Okay, lots of numbers on there. I'm not worried about that. Again, these failures are hugely problematic on here. Let me add another component to this as well. Most organizations have mismatches between their master data management and their business process architecture. And you sort of say, oh, what does that mean? Well, your business process architecture is what consumes the master data. And believe it or not, these things have to be in tuned. So I want to take a slight little detour here and talk about, I sort of did a lot of work in reverse engineering of data, where you can actually reverse engineer your processes as well. And these processes will allow you to understand the process architecture that is relevant to your master data management initiative. This is one company. There are a couple of them out there that do this. What they do is they read log files. Now, I know that sounds terribly exciting, but if you have an automated program that reads your log file, it can actually tell you when certain transactions are happening and how much time has elapsed since the last step in the process. It'll also help to uncover dependencies and other aspects of the organization that will give you information about your business process. And the reason that's important is because if you don't have a good idea of what your business processes are, you will not have a good fit between your master data management and the rest of it. Here's another analogy. Most of us are familiar with the traditional engine. We, of course, for years tried to improve the efficiency of these engines. We're caught, at least here in America, between wanting big, powerful engines and not wanting to spend a lot of money on gasoline. So here's an engine that's running. Now, as we were doing this, many organizations tried for years and years to come up with a better way of approaching this. Of course, the electric car was interesting. There were actually tons of electric cars around the turn of the century where they were working on them, but they wouldn't go very far. In order to get a working car, we had to wait until Toyota came up with the idea. Now, this is a little quick video that shows how Toyota solved the problem of being an electric engine or a gasoline engine. Most of the time, I don't know about you guys, in my old cars, I was always happy that the engine turned on in the morning. That was like kind of good. When you have these hybrid cars, the engine stops when you come to a stoplight. So that's a little bit unnerving. What Toyota did is they solved the problem of starting the engine. Okay, start it, stop it, start it, stop it, and it was not a problem. But the other piece that they did, which is so brilliant, was that they said, no, it's not a matter of an electric engine or a gasoline engine. It's a matter of how can we get the two of them to work together. So what you're seeing in this video is somebody's foot down on the right there. They're putting their foot on the brake. When they put their foot on the brake, notice what happens. The electric motor pumps electricity back into the battery. So they generate electricity by braking. Then when you go back and turn the engine on again, the engine starts to produce, if the battery gets low, it'll charge it up on its own. It's a very complex, highly interactive system. And people, when they get in Priuses for the first time, look at this little diagram and they're just fascinated by it. You know, wow, what's actually going on? Well, again, the brilliant piece was Toyota figuring out that it wasn't a matter of either a gasoline engine or an electric engine, but how can we take the good parts about gasoline engines and the good parts of electric engines and make them work well together? And my 05 Prius is still running here in 2018, so I guess it was a pretty good design for them to come up with. Key here is that you need to have good process integration around your master data management initiative, or you won't, because these things can be extraordinarily complicated. And I'm not going to walk you through this. This is a chart just from a colleague that had put this together and come up with it just to show you how complex the entire architecture can be. Again, we want to make sure this happens, but we want to make sure this happens in a fashion where it's understood so that you can select the right software and the right practices to put in place. So let's look at some specific building blocks around this. What we tend to look at is that the goals of a program are to provide authoritative source of high-quality reference and master data to lower costs, to support business intelligence all the way around in order to do that. It means you need to understand the reference and master data integration needs, that you need to understand master and reference data sources and contributions. You need to define the data architecture that is integration focused. You need to implement the reference and master data management solution, the rules, the golden records. There's a lot to do here, right? This is quite a bit of information. What it really boils down to is a couple of key questions. Who needs what information? What data is available? How do those data sources differ from each other? And how can we reconcile the inconsistencies? What this means is that your organization has to understand what it's attempting to do. If you try to just buy a master data management solution and think it's going to solve your problem, unfortunately, you will be sadly disappointed in there. So it's a matter of really understanding the way the organization works. It requires a bunch of different components. You're going to have to, I've already mentioned several times, you don't want to put bad quality data into a good system because people will blame the system. You need to understand the specific requirements that you have around it. You need to document them with models and other types of documentation. You need to have reliable reference and master data in catalogs. You need to have that golden lineage process. We're now calling lineage provenance for some reason. I guess the word sounds fancier in order to do that. And of course, get some metrics and reports in order to do this. You need a team to do this. You need steering committees, the stewards, subject matter experts, different types of consumers that are involved. If your organization is working with organizational standards, then that's a component as well. Also need, of course, to have consumers. So people are going to supply, people are going to consume. Go back to our original diagram I showed you a half hour ago of the sources and uses of the data, right? So this is a specific piece in the middle of all of this. Again, stewards, subject matter experts, it takes a village, if you will, to try and pull all of this stuff together. Now, really key for looking at this is that there's a lot of good technology that exists. And what we tell organizations is that it's probably not in your best interest, even if you don't have a master data management solution, to go out and spend 6, 7 figures, 8 figures trying to buy some of these. I worked with one company that spent $60 million on one of these initiatives. It was a technical success in the sense that they were able to actually install the software. But within about 1.5 years of installing the software, they didn't have good governance. They didn't have good data quality that went in there. Then you would hear people in the hallway saying, well, I couldn't figure out where to stick the data, so I stuck it in the MDM. That's not a good sign. So using your own technology, you can, through ETL, you can build stuff. And you guys know we don't endorse products and specific things like that here, except we have sponsorship, of course. You can build your own master data management stack using Microsoft SQL Server. It's not going to stand up for an industrial strength use, but we were working with a healthcare organization recently, and they told us that they couldn't figure out who was a doctor. And I know that sounds like an interesting question. It wasn't actually who was a doctor, but who was a doctor that had privileges, which meant they could admit people to the hospital and work with everybody along those lines. Well, this organization simply didn't have a master list of all the doctors that they worked with. So we said, look, let's just take your SQL Server. You've got a great group here that really understands how to do this, and let's build your own little master data management solution just to keep track of the doctors. Did a little bit of data modeling, determining what was actually a doctor, did some process modeling tools so we could ensure the fit, back to my previous example. We did a lot around metadata to make sure that everybody understood the different ways in which we were referring to the doctor. We did all kinds of profiling of their existing data to find out how close a fit some of their existing sources were so we could come up with the first piece of the golden master. Then we cleaned up the rest of the data. Again, this is just around doctors, integrated those pieces, and actually pushed the master data back in through a series of business process and business rule engines. We, of course, wanted to have change management tools in place as well in order to make that work. So build your own. Now, the idea was if you do those steps, when it comes time to go out and actually buy the master data management solution, when you're ready to scale up, you'll have a much better conversation with the vendors than you will if you're at level 0 and the vendors are at level 5. Really, really key to making sure that you understand how all of that actually works when we pull it together. Seen lots and lots of these types of examples. Let's look at some specific guiding principles and best practices around this. The shared reference and master data has to belong to the organization. Now, I tell a story a lot, which is a story that when I was working for the Defense Department on a specific engagement, and we had an issue where something was being done incorrectly. People were coming to the meetings and saying, you can use my data for this purpose, you can use my data for that purpose. People were kind of, all right, so if I can use this data for this purpose and that data for that purpose, can I still get from A to Z, which is what we're trying to get to? It turns out that if you instead say no, nobody owns that data. It all belongs to the organization. Now you'll have the ability do it in a much better fashion. The other part of it is to understand that there is not really one project that's going to fix it, that it's more of an ongoing data management improvement program. And you'll have some goals for the first cycle. You'll have some goals for the second cycle and some goals for the third cycle, right, all the way along. But it's not just a fix it and then we're done kind of thing. It just doesn't work well that way. Similarly, the idea that the organization now starts to look for what is the best or the golden value is really important. That's a cultural change. It's going to take a couple of years for people to get used to. The one instance that's been a little different from that is that some people come from organizations that do have good data management, and they ask the question when they get to another organization that doesn't, where do you store your master data? And they kind of get this baffled look. Well, what do you mean by master data on this? So these are things that people are now starting to expect, which means that when I make a duplicate, a replicate of that master data, duplicates are uncontrolled, replication is controlled. That's the theory behind those two words. We only make it from these golden sources, that we don't go out and just grab data from anywhere in order to do this. And that this reference data change and master data changes need to be done in a way that is specifically focused in on formal change management practices. Because if we're not doing formal change management, then nobody really kind of knows what's going on as well. Taking those a little further, what do you need in order to make this work? Well, first of all, when I say active involved executive sponsorship, that's of course going to be true for everything. But for this particular discipline, it's really critical to make sure that your executives can at least do the little bit that I did there with the gender codes. They don't have to know about Canada, but they have to know that your organization maintains 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever the number of gender codes it is, that's reference data, and that reference data applied to a specific customer then becomes customer, because you wouldn't want to introduce yourself as a business to a customer using the wrong surname, the wrong title, the wrong honorific, et cetera, et cetera. The business should own the data governance process, as well as the MDM, or customer data integration project. They call that a lot as well. If it's run as an IT project, IT tends to put the software in, flip the switch, and say, hey, it's running, I think our job is done. Well, hopefully if you're getting nothing else out of this little quick webinar, you'll realize that master data is not something you do and you're done with it. It's an ongoing process, and therefore the ownership has to be over on the business side. IT is not well structured to run long-term initiatives around this. IT is a very good project orientation. It's a little challenged in the area of project orientation. But you still need strong project management, and you still need strong organizational skills management. It needs to be a combination of people, process, technology, and information. If you're missing any one of those 4 pieces, you are very unlikely to succeed, given everything else that's going on. And finally, from this first set of 5, build your processes to be repeatable, ongoing, which means your process architecture for your organization is absolutely likely to change. In many cases, it can be changed for the better, and that's terrific as well. Continuing now with our best practices, number 6, management needs to recognize the importance of a dedicated team. If you don't have data stewards that are in the organization already, it's going to be very difficult to implement master data management, because how do you assign responsibility for that entire process? You need to understand the hub that you're using and how it integrates with your internal systems and external systems. I'm reminded of an ERP that we were involved with for many years ago, and there's just one piece that we added a new organizational master data management record. We had to send off a batch job to reinitialize the database. Well, the concept of a batch job in today's environment is really, really problematic. Another thing that's going to happen is that the master data management is probably not going to match your existing processes. I urge you strongly to resist the urge to customize your MDM solution. I have never seen it work well. Almost always the set of facts that these software packages are keeping track of are very, very well proven in the marketplace. Customizing the package means that every time you change any aspect of what you're doing, you're going to have to make sure that the next release of that package supports the business practices that you have in order to do this. Make this as inexpensive as possible. Now, this is, again, keeping in mind that I've already told you to build your first one yourself so you can learn about it. But when you get to the industrial strength part, stay current with the patches that are provided on there. And then, again, make sure that you have lots and lots of testing around the overall process. This will allow the organization to start moving forward in terms of what it's attempting to do. Now, I'm going to stop here for just a minute and sort of dive off into a story here. This is a story that I ran across at an organization. It was kind of fun. It was a retail organization, and what they were trying to do was the basic upsell. Now, the upsell in this case is, would you like fries with that? And most people go, what are you talking about, fries, right? Well, if you're in retail and somebody orders a burger, if the person behind the counter says, do you want fries with that, they will get more sales than if they don't say, would you like fries with that? So it's become a large joke in the organizations, in the industry on that. But this organization didn't want to sell fries, they wanted to sell batteries. As they were going through and selling their various products and services to people, what they were discovering was that they almost always were selling things that needed to have batteries with it. The customers weren't buying batteries. You might think to yourself, okay, this sounds pretty easy. Let's just go through their entire catalog and take the master data items that are not batteries and make them into master data items so that we can then start to make sure that we can link the battery types. After all, there's only a couple battery types, right? A, B, C, I don't know how many B's actually, A, C, AA, D, you know, all these types of batteries, and they're kind of standardized, right? Well, guess what? When you look at products, not everything that is a battery is labeled battery. And not everything that is labeled battery is in fact a battery. So they had a really interesting challenge, and they asked us to come into their organization in this master data management context and develop something they called a measure of batteryness. Now, the reason I'm going to tell you the story in this fashion is because it shows a couple of things. First of all, the way in which they approached this master data management problem was very, very instructive, and we'd like to use this as a teachable example. But it also shows how far one should go when attempting to implement automated means. So the idea was that if we could troll through the 30 million products that were in this organization's catalog and figure out something was either a battery or it was not a battery definitively, those would be two good things. If we could do that automatically, it would be better. Of course, we couldn't because of the reasons I told you before. Not everything that's labeled a battery is in fact a battery, and not everything that is a battery is labeled a battery. So that makes it a little bit more difficult. So what we were able to do was go through this 30 million item catalog and pull out all of the master battery solutions. We got the ones that were easy. Requires 2A batteries, or this package contains 2 AA batteries. Those are pretty good. We can get those. But other aspects were problematic. There were also things that didn't say battery and didn't have anything to do with, if a product that does not require electricity, that was a pretty good indication that it was not going to go into that master list. So we had some things we could definitely put in one pile and some things we could definitely put in another pile, neither of which were particularly instructive or interesting. Those were sort of the low-hanging fruit. That left us with a bunch of other things in the middle. And the things in the middle we then needed to go in and ask other questions about through a series of profiling and query types of exercises. And what we'd come up with was a score of batteryness. This thing resembles a battery because, and we had several attributes of batteryness, right? It might fit into a C-size battery container. It might have do not dispose of in a fire written on it, which is a pretty good indication it's a battery. Other things like that. And as we started to build this up, we would run the algorithms that we had developed through the data set and find out, yes, this is very interesting from a battery perspective, or this is probably not a battery perspective. We developed a percentage. Okay? So if a thing was more than 50% a battery, then it might actually be a battery. If it's less than 30% a battery, it probably wasn't a battery. And we could tweak these pieces and allow the organization to go through and see what types of things came up. Now, this is probably not terribly interesting because most of you out there are not going to have to develop a measure of batteryness. But what you will have to do is develop a very good objective definition of what is master data for your organization. Because if you don't have that definition of what is something that is obviously master data, for example, my customer record might be master data, then you'll never be able to get everybody on board with understanding the nuances between the difference of master data and transactional data. This master data for the batteries allowed this organization to learn a lot about, first of all, how their master data management solution was running and how, in this case, their master list of products that needed batteries could be treated differently when it came time to check out than everything else, so that this organization, at the very bottom of everything, these people could ask on the website as they were doing this, do you want fries with that? Only in this case it was batteries, and they were able to pull that particular piece off. Let's go a little further. We got a couple of takeaways that we want to do here. Get close to the top of the hour. Again, success in this area is very, very interesting. You'll see an awful lot of organizations that will go in, but what happens is, did the software go in? That's all IT is going to worry about, right? Did the software go in and does it work? If they can turn it on, their problem is done, right? Well, it's more likely that your success will be, that your project will be successful if the users understand the limitations and strengths of MDM. MDM is not a technology. It is a strategic approach to managing some parts of your data. And some parts of your data don't change very much. My name over the years has stayed reasonably consistent, okay? 100% consistent. That's probably a likely candidate for master data. On the other hand, just because your name changes doesn't mean that it's not a candidate for being master data. The idea is make sure you have a lot of good education. Take these small steps that we've talked about, and again, building your own master data management stack. Let's just say that your organization decides that it would like to have some master data managed, maybe as a result of hearing this webinar. Find your SQL programmers inside. Get your SQL server up and running. Make sure that you can manage some master data internally with a database. You don't need specialized software for this. The process of doing that for a year will make you so much smarter and cost you so much less money than going out and spending 10 figures, 6 figures, 8 figures, whatever the number is, in order to do that. These small steps are going to be extremely helpful. Make sure that people understand the initiatives. Remember the bank example I gave earlier where they were trying to get access to the various channels? The only purpose of that exercise was to improve our ability to know when we had been in contact with the customer. It was not about selling more to them. It was about a business goal of saying, how engaged are we? If we don't understand how engaged we are, it's really hard to say, hey, I haven't seen you in 3 years, or I just saw you last month, right? That could get completely annoying. It would look like the person that's managing your money don't actually know what they're talking about. I mentioned also your process architecture. Obviously, if you can't see it at this point, probably on the wrong webinar. You need to have an information architect involved in this as well, because your information from a data perspective is going to be very important mashing in. If you don't know what your data architecture is, it can't be helpful to the entire program. You're going to have a governance framework that's going to ensure that these individuals are trained and are able to do master data management the way they'd like to. You got to have a strong alignment with the business vision. This is strategy. You shouldn't be doing master data management for just the sake of doing master data management, but I can tell you that McDonald's would probably go out of business tomorrow if people stopped asking for, would you like fries with that? That's how big an impact it has on the sales. So I'm sure there is a good alignment there. Use these MDM frameworks that I've talked about here to evaluate your program activity. Are we making progress in the right direction? Are we taking and achieving the kinds of things that we're attempting to do from a business perspective? Forget about the technology. We can get technology to do anything. Number 8, make sure that you've got that high-level sponsorship, which means the sponsor shouldn't be just somebody who says, I understand this, but understands the difference between master data and reference data. If they don't, you're unlikely to have success with them in the long run. Many executives become confused by technology and simply don't want to deal with it and let somebody else deal with it. Many executives are totally, they're really fascinated by it. Find out which ones you have and make sure that you have the right conversations with them. Start by creating a master data management strategy and a vision that mirrors, supports the organization's vision all the way around. Make sure that you have a measures hierarchy. This is where things like taxonometric and semantic understanding can be helpful. Do not start with these, but if you have a pretty good set of these things already running, it can be extremely helpful to start looking at these other concepts. A business case is something that is going to be important. I'm grading projects for my students right now, and most of the time they put together very nice architectural diagrams, and I write at the bottom of it, so what? In other words, what's going to happen to the business as a result of this investment in people, processes, and technologies? Make sure that the business understands their own key performance indicators. They're the ones that are going to be telling you whether this is successful or not, and if they don't develop these KPIs, the ones that IT keeps are not going to be very relevant to the situation. Measure the situation both before and after. This is true about any aspect of data management. If you don't know where you're starting from, you're certainly not going to know whether they did what they were supposed to when it's done. Make sure that you translate that change in metrics then into financial results. I've got an entire book that talks about that. We'll do that webinar later this year. And yeah, we need to have this be a partnership between the business and IT all the way around. So I've got just a minute or two left here, and what I want to do is show you one of the best examples that I've ever seen of how to articulate your MDM project. So let me give you the setup on this. This is British Telecom, a company you certainly have heard of, very fine organization. And what they decided to do was that they wanted to have everybody in the organization, not just the IT people, not just the business people, everybody in the organization understand what the focus of this MDM was. So this hits a couple of these key success factors that we have here. I want you to imagine getting an email from the president of British Telecom. And when you click on this email, here's what happens. That's 46 seconds. I'm going to do it again just so that I can narrate this time. I want you to hear the cute little music that goes on it. So remember, this is an email from the president of British Telecom going to every employee in the corporation. And when they opened this, it played a little bit of animation. A great customer experience starts with excellent data. Previously, information was stored in hundreds of databases across British Telecom. Processes were duplicated and effort was wasted. It was all a bit messy. So now we're sorting all of our data into 7 files. They called this initiative the 7 Sisters. And what they found was that this engaging little process, that finished up, making it much easier to do it. This engaging little process allowed them to come back and test and ask questions, and people were able to identify some of the 7 pieces. Now, this is even the clerk, all right? Everybody in the company watched this because it came from the president, and many people watched it multiple times because it's cute, plus it's a really well-done little articulation. So what we've tried to do here is go through the entire set here of all that is involved in the world of reference and master data management. Remember, this is a strategic approach to data management. It is not about technology. Technology should be the last thing that you buy. If you understand all the rest of this, you'll probably have better success with all this. So we've got some upcoming webinars, and of course we're all going to be gathering in San Diego in a couple of weeks out there to do this. And I think, Shannon, didn't I hear that you guys were like close to selling out or something? It was really, really big crowd coming in this year. But anyway, time for Q&A.
Indeed, and Peter, thank you so much for a great presentation. Sorry for the rough start there, folks, that we got it all sorted. Again, just a quick reminder to answer the most commonly asked question. I will be sending a follow-up email by end of day Thursday for this presentation with links to the slides, links to the recording, and anything else requested throughout. So, you know, Peter, you touched on it a little bit, but could you expand a little bit more on multi-domain MDM?
Sure. So what you're trying to figure out there, and that is definitely an advanced topic, but let's just pull up the slide for that. It may be that it is, in fact, inappropriate for your organization to manage all of the master records for the organization all the way across the organization. Instead, it may make more sense to do this in a series of subdomains. Let's just take, our big boogeyman today of GDPR, right? Maybe the part of the organization that is subject to GDPR should be run by one set of master data management practices, and the stuff that is outside of GDPR is managed by another. These are things that you guys are the experts. You guys know your organization. It doesn't do any good for an outsider to come in there and say, hey, I think I know what you should do. That's where your expertise comes in. And yes, it is perfectly reasonable to set up little sub-versions of this to say, hey, this is going to handle this type of stuff, and this is going to handle the stuff for these guys. Like maybe your commercial customers are different from your retail customers. Again, lots of reasons for doing this, but the architecture remains the same. You may want to have this govern the entire organization, or it may be a really bad idea because the organization has different needs. That's why understanding your process architecture is so important in order to do this properly. Great question. Thanks, Shanna.
So what advice do you give or do you have for an organization who has implemented an MDM solution for a few subject areas and is just now wanting to implement data governance?
Well, that's kind of backwards. So let me get to a slide here. Go back to this little story that I was telling, and I'm just going to bring this up here so everybody can see it. This story was an organization that did that. They put in the master data management solution, but they did not have governance around it. Consequently, there was no control over the data that comes in. Now, I'm not saying that if you don't have a data governance organization, you can't control what goes into your MDM, but the likelihood of something not being controlled and therefore polluting the data that's in the MDM is much higher without governance. That is the purpose of governance, right? We want to have something out there that says we're going to manage this data with guidance. And the guidance is MDM is a very good technique for solving some kinds of problems. It is not a good technique for other kinds of problems, and that's where the governance group should be allowed to do this. Again, I mentioned this earlier, the hardest part for most organizations is coming up with a rule where you can say this, because it fits this rule, is now master data. And this, because it doesn't fit that rule, is not master data. That, believe it or not, is almost the hardest thing to do in any MDM exercise. I've worked with lots of organizations that have tried, just not succeeded. That's where governance comes into play in a very, very crucial role. The other part of this story, of course, was that they not only did it without governance, but they also did it without quality. And, of course, governance can mandate quality as well. It's kind of like the cloud. Most organizations will look at the cloud and be like, oh, cool, cheap storage, I don't have to pay for it as much, it's great, right? Now, the cloud is actually a great place to do some quality control because if something's in the cloud, it should have some characteristics as opposed to data outside of the cloud. Again, we won't get into this in this one, but my three characteristics are data inside the cloud should be, by definition, higher quality than data outside the cloud. If about the reverse, it doesn't make any sense. So, of course, it should be higher inside the cloud. Data that's in the cloud should be more shareable by definition, and that's an engineering characteristic. We can measure that. And finally, data that's inside the cloud should be actually of less volume than data outside the cloud because it is shareable and of higher quality. So same thing here, the data that's in your master data management initiative should also be of higher quality than data that is not in that initiative. It should be, by definition, more usable, more shareable by the rest of the organization, and therefore it's probably going to be less in volume as well. If you're in that situation where you've got it running, I'd recommend running a couple tests against it, and if you find you're getting some less than desirable results, I'd start raising the flag and saying, hey, we need some help over here. hopefully that answers the question. Great one.
It does. Well, it also answers the next one. You were very fortuitous there because the next it was about the cloud. So
I think we got 2 in 1 on that then.
Yeah, it's very, but just, maybe if you want to expand a little bit on MDM in the cloud, this question specifically was regarding, vendors are pushing for this, and it sounds like you recommend it, and then it's maybe easier to maintain data governance and data quality in a cloud environment than otherwise. Well,
I first of all, it's a very definitive place, right? Now, there's a transition. It's a binary thing. It's either in the cloud or it's not. And if the data is in the cloud, then yes, like I said, those 3 attributes that I described a minute ago are coming to play. But what you're also seeing here too is that the vendors are saying we can run your master data management in the cloud. There are some distinct advantages to running in the cloud. Again, if you haven't seen a Microsoft commercial saying they can support soccer teams all over the entire world through their cloud, and they do, yeah, you're definitely missing out on some opportunities. But that's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, right? It's not going to work for every organization. So you all, our audience, people who are listening to this webinar, are the people who are best empowered to make those decisions. And if you understand the trade-offs, if I put it in the cloud, then it requires more overhead. It's going to require a higher level of governance than if I was just going to manage it locally, because the cloud does have some additional security features that can be very important and have been fatal to some organizations' efforts around that area. Yeah, we should probably, Shannon, look at some cloud offerings around this, because there's some really interesting topics that are happening here. The next thing will be blockchain in the cloud, right? Get it all done.
Indeed, so many new techs and lots of questions still around the cloud. But so how many master data domains or dimensions are usually enough in Golden Record as an average?
Well, there's really very little way of saying this is the way it's going to work. Again, go to our 7 sisters for British Telecom. This project is actually kind of old, and they have some good history that they've done with it, come up with some really, really good results. 7 turned out to be a good number for this organization. I would not say, unless you happen to think you're exactly like British Telecom, that 7 is probably the right answer for you. So let's look at your organization and see what you can come up with in there and figure out, think about it. What are the piles, the buckets, whatever term you want to use, that would represent major collections of information? I'm going to go back to our definition about which we are going to maintain identifiers, okay? Parties, places, and things. And from there, I'm not saying that you want to have everything in the parentheses in there, but some of those things, if you are an organization that depends heavily on customer interaction, probably a master record for your customers is good. Now, even that can be problematic. If you're saying by customers, well, what if you've got 2 customers in the same household, right? Do you want to treat them the same? I've had instances where organizations have merged them together, and then the one spouse comes to the other spouse and goes, well, I see you're buying a really nice kayak for me for my birthday. I appreciate that very much. And the other's totally ruined the surprise. Why? Because the customer organization that they were doing decided their master data management should be done at the household level rather than at the customer level. So the household got all the messages, and therefore there was no secrets. Now, it could be good, it could be bad. Again, it's interesting, and of course this is why we are gravitating to this profession, because these are really challenging problems that organizations don't have a lot of expertise to solve right at the moment.
All righty. Well, I think everyone is still in shock that it's daylight savings time. Everyone's pretty quiet today. I know I'm struggling with it.
You can see here in Washington, I don't know if you guys have got the word yet, but President Trump fired Secretary Tillerson today, and everybody's all agog about that. And we also have the students out on the streets protesting about getting shot in schools, which is probably a good thing. Yeah, it's an interesting day here in D.C.
I bet. Well, that is all the questions we have for today. So thanks, everyone, for the questions we did get, and thanks for attending another great webinar from Peter. We hope to see you next month, where we're going to be talking about data modeling fundamentals. And I hope everyone has a great day. Peter, thanks so much. Hope you have a nice trip.
And I will look forward to seeing you out in San Diego in a couple weeks.
Sounds good. Bye, all.
Thanks, Jamie. Bye, everybody.